By the first week of September in 1864, I finally held the thing I had spent 4 months and the lives of thousands of men to take. Atlanta was mine. The guns had fallen silent. The Confederate army had slipped away into the dark toward the south, and the city that the whole country had been holding its breath over was at last in my hands. And do you know the first order I gave once it was? The very first thing I chose to do with the prize I had bled for, I emptied it. Not of soldiers, of families. The women, the children, the old men who had never once lifted a rifle in their lives. I ordered every civilian in Atlanta to leave their homes and go. When the mayor of that city sat down and wrote to beg me to take the order back, the letter I sent in return has followed my name from that day to this. People still quote a single line of it, and they almost always quote it to prove that I was a monster. What they almost never do is read the rest of it. So before you decide for yourself what kind of man I was, come back with me to that week in September, and let me show you exactly what I held in my hands and exactly what I chose and why. In all the long years that followed, I never once took it back. To understand the order, you first have to understand the road that brought me to it, because that road was paid for in a currency of men. For the whole of that long summer, my armies and the Confederate forces had clawed their way south out of Tennessee toward Atlanta, mountain by mountain and river by river, and we had paid in blood for every mile. I will not pretend it was clean work. At a place called Kennesaw Mountain, I sent my men straight up a fortified slope against an enemy who could not miss, and I watched them fall in rows for almost nothing, and I learned the lesson and went back to maneuver instead. Month after month, I pushed the city's defenders backward, not by smashing them in a single blow, but by reaching always around their flank, forcing them to fall back or be cut off, until at last there was nowhere left for them to fall back to. Atlanta was not just another name on a map. It was the workshop of the Confederacy in the West, a tangle of railroads and foundries and arsenals that fed the Southern war machine the way a vein feeds a heart. As long as that city stood and worked, the rebellion in that part of the country had a pulse. Take Atlanta, and you reached in and stopped it. That is why two nations spent an entire summer watching a single city, as if the whole war turned upon it. In a sense, it did. The man defending it, the Confederate General John Bell Hood, was a fighter to the bone, a man who had already given an arm and a leg to the war, and seemed determined to give the rest of himself as well. He threw his army against mine again and again in those final weeks, attacking when wiser men would have dug in, and he bled his own force nearly to ruin in the trying. In the end, he could not hold. On the night he gave up the city, his own men set fire to their ammunition trains rather than leave them for me, and the explosions tore through the dark and lit the Georgia sky for miles, so bright that men said you could read a newspaper by the glare of them. By morning, the place lay open. I rode in through streets that were not yet cold, and I sent a telegram north that I knew would be printed in every paper in the Union. Atlanta is ours, and fairly won. For one single morning, I let myself feel the full weight of those 4 words. But taking a city and keeping it are 2 very different problems, and the second is the harder of the 2 by far. Hold that thought close, because everything that men still curse me for grew straight out of it. I never wanted Atlanta as a city. I wanted it as a fortress, and a fortress and a living city cannot share the same ground. My lifeline back to the north was a single, fragile railroad, more than 100 miles of it, running all the way to Chattanooga, and every mile of that line was a target for raiders and a weight upon my men. I could barely feed my own soldiers across that thin thread of iron. I certainly could not feed 20,000 hostile civilians stacked on top of them. I could not spare the troops it would take to guard those people, to police them, to chase down the spies who would surely hide among them, and to put out the fires they might set behind my back while I slept. An army cannot do its work with a frightened, hungry, resentful population pressed against its spine, watching for its chance. So, in the early days of September, I gave the order I knew the whole world would hate. Every civilian, every family would leave Atlanta. Those who wished to go north could go north. Those who wished to go deeper into the dying Confederacy would be carried south under a flag of truce, with their belongings at my own army's expense. But none of them would stay. I even offered Hood a pause in the fighting, a short truce, so that the people could be moved without being caught between 2 armies. I told myself that the truce was a kindness. Perhaps it was the only kind of kindness I had left in me to give. The Confederates answered exactly as I knew they would. General Hood wrote to me in a cold fury, and he called my order the most studied and ingenious cruelty in the whole dark history of war. He wanted to lay the full shame of it upon my shoulders, and mine alone. I wrote back, and I refused to carry it for him. I reminded him who had fired the first guns of this war, who had torn the country clean in two, who had made all of this cruelty necessary long before I ever set foot in Georgia to deliver it. Hood and I traded those letters like two men shouting across a deep canyon, each of us certain that the other was the villain of the story. But Hood was a soldier, and a soldier expects hard words from the enemy across the field. What I did not expect, what gave me pause in a way that Hood's fury never could, was the letter that came after his. It was written not by a general at all, but by a tired civilian who had stayed behind in the conquered city to face me on behalf of every soul I had just sentenced to the open road. The mayor of Atlanta was a man named James Calhoun, and here lies the part of this story that almost no one ever troubles to tell. Calhoun was no fire-breathing champion of the rebellion. He had stood against secession when the question first came to a vote, a man who never wanted this war and now found himself, by accident of office, the keeper of one of its greatest prizes. He was a lawyer by trade, a man of order and of quiet process, the sort who believes that even in the worst of times a reasonable argument, made plainly to a reasonable man, might still turn a hard thing aside. And so, with two of his city councilmen standing at his side, he sat down on the 11th of September and made that argument to me in writing. His letter did not threaten me, it did not posture, and it did not bargain. It simply laid out, in plain and almost unbearable detail, what my order would do to the people of his city. He wrote to me of women in the very last months of carrying a child who had nowhere on this earth to be carried themselves. He wrote of mothers with infants still at the breast and no husbands left to lean on, the men being dead or taken prisoner or far away at the front. He wrote of the sick and the aged who could never survive a journey out into a countryside that the armies had already stripped bare of every last scrap of food and shelter. Where, he asked me directly, were these people supposed to go? The South had no empty homes standing ready to take them in. There was no charity left to spare in a land that was itself slowly starving. To send them out, he wrote, was not to move them to some other place. It was simply to abandon them with no place at all left to go. It was, by any human measure, a powerful letter. It was the sound of a decent man pleading for his neighbors, and pleading well, with everything that he had. And it came to rest on the desk of the one general in that entire war, least likely to be moved by an appeal to pity, and most able to explain, in cold and complete sentences, exactly why he would not bend. Keep the mayor's words held in your mind, all of that suffering that he set down so carefully, because within a single day I was going to answer every line of it. And the answer I gave him is the reason you know my name at all. I read Calhoun's letter, and I want to be honest with you about something, because the legend leaves it out entirely. I did not read it without feeling. Whatever the South came to believe of me in the bitter years after, I was not a cruel man by nature. I had a wife and children of my own, and I knew exactly what I was asking of those families, and I did not lie to myself and pretend that it would be painless. But feeling a thing and surrendering to it are not the same act. And by that autumn, I had finally let myself understand a truth about this war that the mayor, for all his goodness, had not yet allowed himself to look at directly. So I wrote back to him on the 12th of September, and I told him the thing that has hung around my neck like a millstone ever since. I told him that war is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. Those who brought this war down upon the country, I wrote, deserved every curse and every malediction that a suffering people could pour upon them. He might as well go and stand outside and appeal against the thunderstorm, I told him, as appeal to me against the hardships of war. I did not make the cruelty. I had inherited it the very same as he had, the same as every man on both sides of that bloody line had inherited it from the men who first lit the fire. The only question still worth the breath to argue was how to bring it to an end. And that, the part the men who quote me always let fall to the floor, was the true heart of the whole letter. I did not believe in a gentle war. I had come to believe that a gentle war was simply a long war wearing a kinder mask, and that a long war was the cruelest thing of all, because it killed slowly, and it killed the young by the hundreds of thousands, and it went on killing them year after year after year. I had decided that the faster and the harder the blow fell, the sooner the whole nightmare would burn itself out, and the sooner these very families could return to their homes and live in peace again. Make war so terrible, so total, so impossible, to dress up in flags and bands and glory, and men would at long last stop wanting it. That was the logic I lived by and fought by, and would die still believing in. You may judge it to be monstrous. I ask only that you understand that it was a logic and never once a madness. And I told Calhoun something else in that same letter, written in the very same breath as the cruelty, because both of these things were true of me at once. I told him that when peace finally came, he could call upon me for anything at all. That I would share with the people of Atlanta my last cracker and stand watch over their homes and their families against danger from every quarter as if they were my own blood. I meant every single word of it. The man who emptied the city and the man who offered to feed it were one and the same man, holding two truths at once that most people cannot bear to hold in the same hand. That is the thing the world has always refused to understand about that letter. It is not the confession of a monster. It is the confession of a man who had decided, with his eyes wide open, that mercy in the long run would demand cruelty in the moment, and who was willing to be hated for the rest of time in exchange for making that trade. The mayor read my answer, and there was nothing left in it for him to argue against. I had not denied a single thing that he had written. I had told him, line by line, that all of it was true, and that none of it changed what had to be done. And so James Calhoun did the hardest thing the entire war ever asked of him. He went back into his city, and he organized the very expulsion he had just staked his dignity to stop. He helped to count the families. He helped to load the wagons. He stood in the streets of the city he was sworn to lead, and he watched its people gather up whatever they could carry in their own two hands and form themselves into long, slow, silent lines. Think on that for just a moment. The final act of his office as mayor was to carry out with his own hands the order he had begged me on his honor to call off. Under the truce, my army moved them south to a small railroad stop with the strange and gentle name of Rough and Ready, and there, at the raw seam between the two armies, the people of Atlanta were handed across from one side of the war to the other like so much freight, more than 400 families. Wagons heaped high with furniture and bedding, and crying children perched on top of it all. The old being carried by the young, the sick laid out flat in the beds of the carts, staring up at a sky that belonged to neither side anymore. There were children far too young to understand why they were being torn from the only rooms they had ever known, and there were old men too proud to let anyone see on their faces what it cost them to climb down into that road. Some of those families had lived in Atlanta for 2 full generations, and now they were given a single afternoon to decide what an entire life truly weighed and what little of it could be made to fit into the back of one wagon. Everything else they left behind them, in houses they understood, even then they would most likely never walk into again. They went out into a Georgia that had nothing left to offer them, exactly as the mayor had warned me to my face that it would, and a great many of them would not look upon their own doorways again for a very long time, if ever they did at all. That alone would have been enough to fix Atlanta forever in the country's memory as one of the hardest chapters of the whole war. But it was not the end of what I meant to do to that city. It was only the clearing of the stage for what came after. I held Atlanta as a military camp through the rest of that autumn, and as the leaves turned and dropped, I began to plan the thing that would one day make the evacuation itself look almost tender by comparison. I had made up my mind that I would not sit in that captured city guarding a fragile railroad until the war grew old around me. I would cut myself loose from the line entirely. I would abandon my own supply, march my whole army straight through the living heart of Georgia all the way down to the sea, feed it off the fat of the land as I went, and tear up everything behind me that could ever feed the rebellion again. And I had no intention whatever of leaving Atlanta standing whole and useful, ready to serve the enemy again the very day my back was turned to it. So in the middle of November, before we marched, my men set to work unmaking the city's power to make war. The depots, the foundries, the rolling mills, the machine shops, the rail yards, the warehouses where the armies of the South had been clothed and armed and supplied. We tore up the railroads and heated the iron rails over great bonfires and twisted them while they glowed around the trunks of trees so that they could never be straightened and laid down again. But fire is an obedient servant only until the moment that it is not. The flames we set to the warworks did not stay where we set them. They leapt from roof to roof through that timber city, and by the time we marched out through the gates, a great part of Atlanta stood as ash and lonely chimneys against a gray November sky. Then I turned my back upon the ruin that I had made, pointed my army east toward Savannah and the open ocean, and we vanished into the body of Georgia, cutting a road of destruction 60 miles wide behind us as we went. Men have argued for more than a century now about whether the person who did all of that was a brute or a realist, or some stranger thing that fits neither word. I will not settle it for you here. I will tell you only this. I never once lost a night's sleep over Atlanta, because I believed then, and I believed it to the very last day of my life, that every hard thing I did brought the morning of peace one day closer, and that a swift and total war was, in the end, a kinder master than a slow and gentlemanly, one that buries the young for years on end and has the gall to call it honor. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. I said it to a desperate mayor in a conquered city, and in all the long years that followed, I never found one good reason to take the words back. But hear me on this last point, because it is the one that matters most of all. The emptying of Atlanta and the burning of Atlanta were never the proof of what I meant by those four words. They were only the rehearsal for it. The true argument, the one that would teach the whole South and the whole watching world exactly what total war was going to cost them, began the very moment I led my men out of those smoking ruins and pointed them toward the sea. And what happened on that long road across 300 miles of Georgia is a story all its own.